It's Andrew with All Things Fantasy, and today I'm bringing you episode 4 of my draft guide series. And today we're talking about tight ends. So, like my quarterback video, I'm only giving you top 15, so like the top half tight ends in 2016, mainly because tight end's a player that you only have one on your team, and tight ends aren't like a really overused player. You just only need one, and you're not going to be like really digging deep into like the bottom half, the tight ends in the league. You're really only focused on the top tight ends for season-long fantasy. So that's why I did top 15. So for tight ends are really interesting. There's really, like, in my opinion, three elite tight ends right now in the NFL, and that's my one, two, and three. Rob Gronkowski, Jordan Reed, and Greg Olsen, obviously all being really, really good tight ends who are putting up consistently big numbers. So I'll just kind of go through them really fast. Gronk, obviously, the best tight end of the league. For the past couple years, for a while now. I've just been dominating at tight end, and as far as like where to draft him at, I think Gronk, he's gonna put up numbers similar to elite receivers and really tough, really elite running backs. And I think some people are gonna draft him early. Some people might think he's a first round guy. Me, I mean, I don't know. Gronk is he's a tricky player to draft because he's such a good tight end. Where that he really separates himself and kind of gets him and like kind of puts himself in that position to like you could like kind of draft him over a running back or a wide receiver kind of, pretty early. And I'll talk about that later, the strategy of drafting him, but he's definitely an early round guy, and it's kind of like all of who's available at the time, and you know if is he better than that wide receiver or running back available when it's your turn to draft. Jordan Reed, a guy who I think is very, very close to Gronk now. He just exploded at the end of last season. I think he's gonna have a great season this year, and definitely a top wide receiver or top tight end. And I think Jordan Reed he's very underrated. I think if you can kind of sleep on him a little bit and get him in like the third or fourth round, like that would be a great steal. In my prediction, he's gonna put up very similar numbers to Gronk. And maybe that's one of the strategies that you could have is just kind of let somebody else draft Gronk and get somebody in a lower round who's going to put up Gronk like numbers at tight end. And so Jordan Reed's a guy I'm really, really hoping to get in my draft this year at tight end. And then Greg Olsen again, another guy, solid, great season last year. Really was really consistent, and I'd expect the same thing this year. Definitely one of the top tight ends. And I love him. He was on my team last year, and he produced pretty well for me. And then so those like the top three, and those are like the elite tight ends. Right? They're kind of like they really separated themselves from everybody else. And then rounding out my top five, I got four Tyler Eifert, who had a really good season as well, but he's just not quite as good as the other three, and he's kind of just outside of those elite tight ends. But also another guy, if you miss, at least one of the first three, and you kind of can sleep on him a little bit and get him in a little bit of later, I mean a little bit, the later rounds, like 5 or 4 or 5. If people aren't, maybe if people aren't, really aggressive at tight ends, which I expect the case to be, he's definitely a guy you can get, and he should, produce pretty well for you. And then 5, Travis Kelce, another guy, he had a pretty good season last year. Actually, Tyler Eifert was questionable. Travis Kelce, I think, missed some games too last year, but I think both these guys are gonna put up pretty consistent numbers, which it's hard to do at tight end. There's not a lot of tight ends who will put up consistently good numbers every week. There's a lot of tight ends who have dud weeks, and maybe they're not targeted that week, and they'll drop really low points. They'll give you like 1 or 2 points, and that's not what you want. So definitely, any of these top 5 guys are going to be pretty consistent, but you got your 3 elites, that you really want to focus on. So my next 5, my 6 through 10, Um, Number 6, we got Delaney Walker, who was a guy who I had on my team for a couple weeks last year, before I traded for Olsen. But yeah, he was pretty consistent last year. But like I said, there was a couple weeks where maybe he just wasn't targeted that much, and he kind of had some bad weeks. But a guy who nonetheless was overall one of the better tight ends in the league, and he had more good weeks than bad. And as far as tight end goes, that's something that's really valuable. And number 7 is interesting. We have Colby Fleener. Kobe Fleener. Um, and he recently went from the Colts to the Saints, which I think is very interesting. Because obviously when he was on the Colts, he wasn't putting up great numbers. I think, he really didn't do much. He definitely was not, in my, opinion, he wasn't even a top, 15 tight end last year. But this week, ESPN had him ranked pretty high. I ranked him a little lower than what they had, but I kind of agree with them. I think going to the Saints is big. The Saints, yeah, Benjamin Watson. They don't have Benjamin Watson anymore. He's on the Ravens, and I think Drew Brees is gonna really bring his numbers up. So definitely Kobe Fleener is guy. He's the guy to sleep on. Like I said, 4th or 5th round. You get him. Maybe he won't be consistent every week, but he'll have more good weeks than bad, and that's valuable in tight ends for a tight end. Number 8, Gary Barnidge. Like he was all the rage last year at the beginning of the last season. All the rage, putting up great numbers, like Gronk-like numbers last year. And he did fall off a little bit, but obviously, last year the rule in fantasy was just avoid Cleveland players, and obviously except for Gary Barnidge early in the season. But you know, Cleveland players were just let you down last year, and nobody was really targeting any Cleveland player for good reason. But Gary Barnidge is definitely a guy who I think you can target this year. It'll be interesting to see. I think you'll kind of know after the first couple weeks if Gary Barnidge is going to produce those numbers he did last year, or if he's going to kind of be a bust. But as of right now, like he is, a top 10 tight end, as far as what he did last season, and from what I expect him to do this season. Number 9, Ladarius Green. A guy who kind of hit an underrated season last year. I think he's definitely going to produce better than he did last season. I just don't think he got the opportunity last season, and I do expect him to come on and be a top 10 tight end. Sorry, that was kind of a tongue twister there. 10, Zach Ertz. Zach Ertz was a guy who was, like I said, he was, some weeks he dropped, a dud number, put up 0 points or 1 point or 2 points, but some weeks he had big weeks, and I think I'm pretty sure he had a 20-point week last season, if I recall. But that's the thing. Like these are the these 10 guys are kind of the guys who kind of have some great weeks, but then some really bad weeks, and and especially with Zach Ertz, like he kind of has as many good weeks as bad weeks, and he's not that consistent. But he does have that upside of having those good weeks, and that's why he's my number 10. Yeah, I mean, for tight ends, like once you get outside of the top 5, it's you're trying to it's not you're kind of outside the cream of the crop, right? You're kind of just picking who's like it's kind of just like the best available. You're not picking from the best players, right? Like they're not like the cream of the crop, they're just kind of what's left, and you gotta make do with what's out there, So my last 5 are 11 through 15. 11, Julius Thomas. A guy, like I said, he was not very consistent. Had some good weeks, but then had a lot of bad weeks, and he's kind of a guy you just gotta pick him. Hopefully, he plays well. In the weeks he needed to play well, maybe the weeks he didn't even play well. That's when he has those dud games. But that's what tight ends are. In the NFL, there's not a lot of consistent tight ends out there. So this is what you're left with, guys that have half the season, half the games they play pretty good and post give you 10 points, and half the games they give you 1 or 2 points, and that's just how the tight ends are this year, and have been for for a while. 12 Antonio Gates. This was a pick that I was like so unsure about. ESPN had him ranked in their top 15, and I just didn't know. I mean, obviously, like he had some great games last year, but he also was a bust a lot, and I'm just a person not a fan of having him on my team. Like I'm gonna try to avoid him, but he is compared to what else compared to the other guys out there, he does deserve to be on this list, the top 15. Um, but then all right, so 13 Zach Miller. This guy I really like. Obviously, I mean I am a Bears fan, but Zach Miller had some great games last year towards the end of the season, and I think really established himself as a good starter when Martellus Bennett was hurt. And I think this guy is gonna maybe creep up in the top 10 this year. And as far as as tight ends goes, and I definitely think he'll be a person that you can rely on in season long fantasy. Um, where maybe some of these guys ahead of him right now aren't guys you want to rely on. Like Julius Thomas might not be drafted in everybody's league. But I definitely think Zach Miller and even my next pick, 14 Jimmy Graham, will be guys that will be drafted. Where Jimmy Graham, obviously he was in a new system last year and they did not know how to use him right. And, as the Seahawks kind of found themselves a little bit at the end of the season, he was a little bit more involved. But at the same time, like, I definitely think it's a huge question mark whether Jimmy Graham will be, you know, the old Jimmy Graham this year, or if he'll continue to struggle, and the Seahawks will continue to, you know, not use him to his full potential. But he obviously he's a very good tight end, and he does deserve to be on this list. But as far as how much Seahawks are using him, he's definitely at the bottom of this list right now. But I definitely think he's a guy that has like a really high. Him and Zach Miller both have like really high ceilings as far as like their max production can be if they're used the right way. They definitely can both be in the top 10. Of tight ends this year as far as numbers goes. And then 15 around my list, Jason Witten. You know, obviously, like he had some good games last year, but again, a lot of bad games. Like kind of the same story for a lot of tight ends. Um, I'm personally, I wasn't a fan of him. I wasn't just a fan of a lot of Cowboys players last year. They seemed to just really let you down all the time. It seemed like the Cowboys were just something bad was always happening, whether it was the running backs or the receivers or obviously the quarterback or even the tight end. Like they weren't reliable at all, and so I kind of try to stay away from Cowboys players. But this year, I think the Cowboys they're kind of going in with a fresh start, and I expect them to be better, being healthier. But who knows? Jason Witten's definitely a guy I'm not gonna try to target, but maybe he could be like one of the last tight ends off the board if somebody like sleeps on tight end, if really forgets to draft tight end, and is just kind of looking for the best available at the time. Probably people. I like one guy on this list, and I think a lot of people will lean towards Jason Witten just because he's a household name in fantasy. But I would recommend trying to get away from that and go somewhere else when if you're in that position. So I want to quickly. So that concludes my list. I'm gonna quickly show you the ESPN's list. So here's ESPN's list, and I'll kind of scroll down a little bit to give you like the top 20. Putting a couple guys. So yeah, they had 15. They had Eric Ebron, who again I just was not a fan of. Look at it last year. Like he had 3 pretty good games. All 3 early in the season. And then, like I said, look at these bad games, bad stretch of games there, bad stretch of games there. End of the season, a couple decent games. But just a guy who I just didn't think deserved to be in the top 15. It wasn't in my top 15. Jordan Cameron, again, like he didn't have one game over 10 points, but he did put up a couple like decent, respectable games for a tight end, but just wasn't a guy who was like, really exploding, and like having crazy good games. Like a guy I would value over him would be like a guy like Zach Miller, who had those who had some really big games, like 22-pointer, 14-point game. Obviously Martellus Bennett was playing over him in the beginning, and he got the starter role, and he really kind of took advantage of it, and that's why I think Zach Miller just really kind of puts himself, kind of really puts himself up on the list. As we get towards the bottom here, like these are definitely guys, avoiding all these guys. Definitely. Martellus Bennett, interesting. Now he's in the Patriots. I don't know how they're going to use him, if they're going to use him. Um, yeah, I do not know what's going to happen there. If Gronk's going to get less touches, or I don't know really what's going to happen there. Um, I wouldn't assume so. I wouldn't assume Gronk's numbers would be affected by it, but I guess this is something to look out for. But yeah, Darius Green. I kind of didn't talk about him a lot, but now he's on the Steelers now. I forgot what they still got rid of. They got rid of Heath Miller. So now he's their guy, and I think this is what they needed. They needed a good tight end. Obviously he had a couple good games last year, but he just wasn't getting used the right way. It's now that he's on the Steelers, I think Big Ben's gonna really you find him and really give him the opportunity to score big. Because if you look at the receivers that he has, like, and he got them so involved last year. Like, there were so many different Pittsburgh receivers last year that I was picking just because like he would get his whole team involved and get his whole team big numbers. But yeah, kind of take a look at this list, and a lot of it, it's really similar to my list. There's a couple players who I kind of moved a little bit, but for the most part, it's pretty similar to my list. As far as my opinion goes. Because like I said, tight end's a position that's not really like too complex. Like it's pretty cut and dry with who are the good tight ends, who are the bad tight ends, and who's getting all the points and who's not. So that has been episode 4 of my draft guide series, tight ends, and thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video.